Thank you. Good morning, everybody. My name is Jared Duval. I serve as chair of the Science and Data Subcommittee of the Vermont Climate Council. Today is December 18th, 2024, and this morning's meeting is a short joint subcommittee meeting between the Science and Data Subcommittee and the Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee of the Climate Council. The purpose of the meeting this morning is to provide Conservation Law Foundation an opportunity to provide feedback to the Agency of Natural Resources via these two subcommittees of the Council regarding the state of Vermont's analysis of expected greenhouse gas emissions, as was recommended by the Attorney General's Office. So with us this morning, I want to welcome two guests who will be presenting to us, Elena Mihaly, who is the Vice President of Conservation Law Foundation in Vermont, and Dr. Asa Hopkins from Synapse Energy Economics. Our agenda for today is for Elena to provide an introduction and some context. Then we will have a presentation from Dr. Hopkins, and then we will have time for subcommittee questions and comments at the end, and then time for public comment after that. So with that, I will invite Elena to unmute and begin. Thank you.
Thanks, Jared. So as was mentioned, my name is Elena Mihaly, and I am the Vice President of Conservation Law Foundation Vermont. I want to thank you for the opportunity to be on this agenda and for putting together this special joint subcommittee meeting. Speaking to you all subcommittee members, I want to personally thank you for your time today, as well as for your service writ large on these subcommittees, because you all are such an integral part of the Global Warming Solutions Act structure, and your work helps make good on the law's promise that Vermont will do our part to tackle this local and global challenge. Because this is undoubtedly a local crisis as much as a national and international one. I don't have to remind you all that every community in Vermont has suffered financial, emotional, physical damage from the deepening climate crisis. And I'm sure you all have your own stories of impact, of damaged driveways, of flooded basements, your favorite restaurant going out of business, struggling with Lyme disease, or losing power for days on end from ice storms. I know that I mourn the winters that I thought my children would have when moving to Vermont. I just brought one of my kids to ski practice earlier this week on a dirty, slush-covered field of grass where we ended up just playing chase. And I'm facing realities in the summer as a parent that I didn't plan for. Oppressive heat, alarming air pollution hazards, the threat of tick-borne illnesses every time that my kids go out in the field to play. For our own sake and for saving ourselves as a species, there's a moral imperative to be a part of the global effort to reduce carbon pollution in line with the science-based limits in Vermont's GWSA. There's also an economic imperative to meet the GWSA mandates. For Vermonters to prosper, we need to keep a pace and in sync with the national and global economy that's already transitioning towards green energy. Otherwise, Vermonters will get left behind on things like modern, clean technology. Finally, wearing my lawyer hat, from a legal imperative perspective, the GWSA requires our government to act. And scientists are clear that we have very little time to make this transition away from fossil fuels. So in 2024, the hottest year on record, we can't afford to take a wait and see approach. And that's where greenhouse gas emissions modeling comes in. In July of this year, the Agency of Natural Resources relied on a model developed by the Energy Futures Group called the Pathways 3.27 model to say the state was generally on track to achieving the January 1, 2025 requirement in the GWSA, and that it didn't need to adopt any more rules to meet the law.
There's a big adjustment.
On a climate. The problem is that the creators.
Sorry to interrupt, Elena. I would just ask that those who are not muted, mute themselves. I think that was Borns Energy and Liz Miller. If you can mute during the presentation, thank you.
Thanks, Jared. The problem is that the creators of the model that the state used, the Pathways 3.27 model, explicitly told ANR not to use the model for determining GWSA compliance. I'll read briefly EFG's disclaimer from their report. Quote, the modeled economy-wide emissions for the GWSA compliance years of 2025, 2030, and 2050 presented in this report should not be viewed as indicative of the state's likelihood of achieving those emission levels in those years.
Most of us are going to be talking about temperatures stuck in the teens.
In other words, EFG wasn't tasked with making the Pathways 3.27 model a sector-wide predictive model for GWSA compliance purposes. Aside from this disclaimer, EFG did not indicate how far off the Pathways model would be if it were used in the way ANR used it. So CLF hired our own emissions modeling expert to investigate the discrepancy and to estimate the impacts of the state using the model in the way that its own expert disclaimed against. As you'll hear from CLF's expert, Dr. Asa Hopkins, in a moment, it turns out the Pathways 3.27 model was not fully calibrated or properly aligned with the state's own greenhouse gas inventory. It's entirely possible to align the state's model in this way, but the state's consultants didn't do that because, as they disclaimed to ANR, this wasn't within their assigned scope of work. As a result of ANR's reliance on an improperly calibrated model, the state's prediction of calendar year 2024 emissions showed an undercounting of what we at CLF approximate to be about 300,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. For context, 300,000 metric tons of CO2e in our atmosphere is like Vermonters driving more than 785 million miles in gasoline-powered passenger vehicles over the course of a year. What does this mean? A properly calibrated model says the state is not on track to meet the 2025 GWSA milestone. It shows a plane on a crash course right into the mountain. And what's frankly so alarming is that the agency has spent the last year telling the Climate Council, the leaders of our state legislature, and the public that we are on track, that it does not need any new rules or updates to ensure meeting the 2025 mandate. I want to be clear. Adopting policies to curb carbon emissions, as you all know, is extraordinary hard work. But we can't afford to lose time putting our feet up because the agency claims we don't need to do that hard work. Vermonters deserve the most accurate forecast of the future, even if that's a daunting view from the cockpit. CLF hired Dr. Hopkins to get a more accurate forecast of emissions. We did not ask him to build a new model. Instead, we asked him to compare the state's model predictions to known historical emission figures and then calculate the difference to gauge the model's accuracy. As you'll hear, there are emissions accounting discrepancies in nearly every sector of the economy. Sometimes the model overcounted emissions, and sometimes it undercounted. But in some, the undercounted emissions add up to a wide margin of error. I know that Agency of Natural Resources Secretary Julie Moore stated in the last meeting of the Science and Data Subcommittee last month that the agency had contracted with the Stockholm Environment Institute and plans to look into calibrating the model against historic emissions. CLF is glad to hear this, and we are bringing our own resources to bear to help update the Pathways model so that it can be a rigorous and suitable tool for predicting future emissions and ensuring that we meet the GWSA milestones. But ANR doesn't only need to fix its model, it also needs to turn its very talented and devoted staff towards researching rules within its authority that will achieve that 2025 emission reduction obligation. To date, we are unaware of any such undertaking. We would like to be here in partnership with the state. We at CLF remain ready and willing to work collaboratively with ANR to better calibrate its model and update or adopt rules as necessary to meet both the 2025 and 2030 emission reduction requirements. I will turn it over to Dr. Hopkins to do a walkthrough of the work CLF requested he conduct. His report is posted to the Climate Council Subcommittee website, and we are happy to make his slides available to any party upon request afterwards. I just want to ask Dr. Hopkins, are you okay with people interrupting you with questions in the middle of your slides, or would you prefer people to wait?
Happy to take questions as it goes. Rather have people be clear as we go than confused most of the way through. So.
Okay, thank you. I will turn it over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Elena. Pleasure to be with you all today. Let me go ahead and share some slides so we can all be looking at the same thing. I'm going to leave this in the share mode where it doesn't take over my whole screen, so I have some chance to see you all if anybody has questions or anything like that. Yeah, thanks to CLF, thanks to the Climate Council, Jared, others for the invitation to come and share these results with you all today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Asa Hopkins. I'm the Senior Vice President for Consulting at Synapse Energy Economics. We're based in the Boston area. Previous to coming to Synapse, I was the Director of Energy Policy and Planning at the Vermont Department of Public Service for about 5 years, from 2011 to 2016. For those of you who don't know Synapse, we've been around for almost 30 years, based in Cambridge, as I said. We work for public interest and governmental clients across the country and internationally, providing analysis of the energy sector and associated environmental and economic impacts. I think with this slide is slightly out of date. I think we just squeaked over 50 people. We're pleased to be able to help out and help Vermont try to work through how exactly where it stands and think about the path forward.
Yes, I'm sorry. I just want to ask you to pause for a second. As is the protocol for all Climate Council meetings, I would ask folks to refrain from using the chat. There will be a public comment period at the end of this meeting for folks to share their opinions and perspectives, but let's please give our presenters the respect to allow them to present without using the chat function at this time. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Greg. Yeah, pleased to see so many former colleagues and friends amongst the folks who are here today. So just a quick summary of the sort of the logic of how we set out to do this analysis. We set out to compare, as Elena described, the model that the state relied upon with the state's GHG inventory. So when I say model throughout this presentation, or pathways 3.27, whatever, that all means the same thing. That's the model that the state relied on when making its determination earlier this year. That just as Elena said, that version of the model is the model that was developed by EFG for their work on thermal emissions policies. We need to do this kind of calibration comparison between the inventory and the model because the state relied on the model to make projections about the inventory. So the inventory is inherently backward-looking. It's a record of what happened, what the best estimate of emissions was in any given year, and it is necessarily lagging. So you need some sort of thing to look forward to say, well, what do we think the emissions will be on a forward-going basis? And that is how the state has used the model. So if the model and the inventory don't agree about the past, then it is unlikely that they are going to agree about the future. So we compared the model's statements about the past with the inventory's statements about the past from 2015 to 2020, which were the years of overlap that the state had at its disposal when it was making its determination, and identified potential implications from that comparison for the accuracy of that model's projection of 2024 emissions. In some cases, the model and inventory are reasonably well aligned. In other cases, they're not. We did find numerous cases in which the inventory and the model differ in a consistent manner, both under or over estimates, which call into question the accuracy of that 2024 projection and give us a sense of how far off that 2024 projection might be. So looking at the overall comparison, sector by sector, we see the first column of numbers, the middle column on the table here, shows what the model projects the 2024 emissions to be by sector. This is the numbers that the state cites say they will be 13,000 metric tons below the limit for calendar year 2024. All numbers shown in here are 1,000 metric tons, KMT. Just so we're all aware of, working with a common set of units. The column on the right shows the approximate corrections that emerge from the comparison that I'll walk through the rest of the presentation. I'm just going to go sector by sector down this list and explain where each of these numbers come from. You'll notice that they all end in 0, right? This is a sort of nearest 10, one significant digit kind of analysis. So where there are consistent differences, where it might be that the plus 80 might correspond to somewhere between plus 60 and plus 100, but the average is around plus 80, for example, right? So it's sort of trying to get an overall sense of where we stand, and then add all those up, and again provide an overall sense that the approximate correction is somewhere between 240 and 320,000 metric tons of underestimate of 2024 emissions, which if you compare against the emissions limit, says somewhere between 230 and 310,000 metric tons over the limit rather than under it. So I'm just going to walk sector by sector through here. As I said, happy to take questions as we go. So in the thermal, that is residential, commercial, industrial sector, we're going to do the three energy sectors first, the biggies, thermal and transportation, and then electricity, which is much smaller, and then go through the non-energy emission pieces. So just to orient you to how these tables are set up, this is common table structure through each of the sectors. This sector is slightly more complicated because we can slice it multiple ways, but we have the residential subsector, and we can compare the inventory emissions over those 6 years to what the model says the emissions were over those 6 years. And then the number on the right-hand side here, the average difference, is the average of the inventory minus the average of the model over those 6 years. So we see here in this sector, in the residential sector, the inventoried emissions over those 6 years are on average 79,000 metric tons above the modeled emissions. And the difference is relatively stable year over year. That's not there are no years in which the model exceeds the inventory. That is a relatively stable difference. For the commercial sector, it's generally much closer. Sometimes one is higher, sometimes the other. And the average difference is only 3,000 metric tons. And in the industrial sector, again, quite similar. Our average difference is about 2,000 metric tons. So across all three sectors, add them all up, on average, the inventory is about 80,000 metric tons, again, to that sort of for one significant digit kind of resolution above the model. We can also look at this by fuel and get a sense that the largest portion of the discrepancy appears to be coming from emissions associated with wood. And the second most amount of the discrepancy coming from delivered fuels, oil and propane. It's possible that what's happening related to wood, and this will come again in the electric sector, is confusion in the modeling about counting CO2 emissions and counting methane and nitrous emissions and biogenic sources, et cetera. But if you try to explain this in that way, it's not sufficient to explain what's going on here. So we're left with a question mark as to how these are as out of alignment as they are, but they are consistently out of alignment, which gives us confidence to say that given that the model basically just carries through a relatively stable world from 2020 to 2024, that the emissions in 2024 are similarly off from what the inventory would likely produce, again, by that 80,000 metric tons or so. Moving on to transportation. Here we have a somewhat different story. The on-road and off-road gasoline and diesel numbers are actually pretty close. They scatter around a bit. It does appear that the model was calibrated to some amount of VMT, vehicle miles traveled data, because it shows that big drop off in emissions from the COVID pandemic in 2020. So the on-road and off-road diesel pieces seem to be actually pretty close. So some amount of calibration effort clearly has gone into getting those to line up reasonably well. Jet fuel, the model just consistently overestimates the emissions from jet fuel, and on lubricants, the model consistently underestimates the emissions from lubricants year after year. They happen to roughly cancel out. So, I overall would say that the model nets out close to zero here, but that doesn't mean that there are corrections or some sort of calibration needed to figure out what's going on in these in the lubricants and jet fuels. Also need to check the inventory doesn't have an other fuels section, and the model doesn't separate out nitrous and methane. So yeah, again, getting these things to line up, some additional work may be necessary to, those pieces, again, overall, this sort of whole sector kind of balances out to zero, but that doesn't mean there's no work to do to get the alignment and the calibration to happen here.
Bram, I see you have a question.
Yes, my apologies for joining late. As I recall, there were some questions about the methodology for the inventory. Did those get resolved? Are we confident that the inventory numbers reflect reality?
Bram, can you say more about your question? I'm not sure to what you're referring to.
Yeah, so in the inventory, I recall there were questions about whether we counted, and it was mentioned here, whether we counted emissions from biomass plants. And yeah, I'm sorry, I have a recollection there were other questions like that about how complete and accurate the inventory number was relative to the actual number of molecules of CO2 going into the atmosphere.
I haven't tried to evaluate the accuracy of the inventory and to track those updates. So I'm not sure I'm in a position to answer that. But maybe others can address that later.
Yeah, I will just say very briefly that there are, in public comment, we have heard, the Climate Council has heard comments to the effect of wanting to be able to see what the biogenic emissions are in addition to the gross and non-biogenic emissions, and that data is in the inventory. So I think that the debate is about kind of how you look at it, but for folks who want to see different types of emissions, that is available to see in the official greenhouse gas inventory. Others may want to comment later, but I don't want to take too long to interrupt your presentation, Asa, just to say that there are multiple ways to view emissions, including biogenic emissions, in the inventory. But what, as I understand it, please correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Hopkins, what you are presenting here is the official greenhouse gas inventory gross estimates by sector as reported by the Agency of Natural Resources versus the modeled emissions.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. So right, if the official state inventory is the official marker for what the state is working from, then we need to be referencing to that. So I will continue to the electric sector to finish out the energy sectors. Here we have a sort of a different kind of challenge that shows up when making the comparison, which is that largely the model just doesn't look like the inventory at all. It's not that they're off by some amount, but we see, particularly if you look in the early years of the comparison, the modeled emissions are really quite low, whereas the inventory emissions are multiple times higher. I think this reflects the fact that the model kind of has its own electric sector model built into it, but which that doesn't really get how the inventory works and that sort of regional market and the renewable energy standard and tracking RECs and all this other kind of stuff that goes into how the inventory works for the electric sector. So rather than look at this overall comparison and say, oh, the electric sector emissions, from the model may be understated by, several hundred thousand metric tons by taking kind of averages or whatever. The better approach here, when they just don't line up at all, is to say, all right, well, what can we say about what the model says about 2024 emissions and what we know from, because one advantage in this sector is that there are only a small number of suppliers, and so you can actually look and just see what they're doing, right? So if we look at the 2024 status for the electric sector in the model, this is the breakdown of what the model says the 2024 emissions would be, about 120,000 metric tons, about a third of which comes from wood of some sort, and a bunch comes from sort of regional gas and oil plants, basically. It doesn't, from digging into the model, it doesn't look like, it looks like these wood-based numbers must be counting some amount of biogenic CO2. If you look just at the methane and nitrous emissions that are associated with wood sources, they don't add up to enough to make this number make sense. So at the very least, this estimate, the model's estimate, is overestimating by about 40,000 metric tons for relating to the wood and waste piece. On the other hand, we also know that Vermont utilities have done a lot of work to offer zero carbon or very low carbon electricity. And so we actually look at what the commitments that Green Mountain Power and BED and WEC and VEC and whatever have made, and the progress in the renewable energy standard. The remaining actual emissions, as would be tracked in the inventory in 2024, may actually be a lot lower. And so there's an upper limit of about of this basically being zero, right? It probably won't actually be zero, but again, to the nearest 10 kind of number, it could be that. There's essentially zero emission electricity. And so the model may be overstating emissions by 120,000 metric tons or so at the high end, compared with what the inventory would eventually show for 2024. So moving to the sort of energy adjacent sector of fossil fuel transmission and distribution, this is natural gas distribution and transmission pipelines. We see that the model doesn't actually separate out or have a line for natural gas distribution, of which there's about 4,000 metric tons of CO2e emissions per year. And they're relatively close on transmission on average. So you could say, oh, well, it's about 5,000 metric tons off, but I'll just leave that as it's close. I think that there's some work here to do the model and check that the model actually really does capture the natural gas distribution system, but otherwise, it's close-ish here, sort of approximately zero difference. But again, you could say, well, it's 5,000 metric tons of understatement. Moving to industrial processes, these are not energy use in the industrial sector, but emissions of other chemicals into the atmosphere that are global warming, that have global warming potential. The two biggest contributors here are ODS, that's ozone depleting substances. This is, or ODS substitutes rather. So when we replaced ozone, we replaced some kind of refrigerants with other kinds in order to address ozone depletion in the atmosphere. The new chemicals are then have high global warming potential, and so to the extent that those chemicals leak, then there's emissions that get counted in the inventory and are also modeled. But we see consistently and to a growing degree in the last few years, it's smaller at the beginning and different later. The inventory's emissions for ozone depleting substances are growing steadily over this 5-year period, where the model is stable. On average, they're different by about 20, but it's possible that for 2024, the trend in the inventory would continue to rise while the model shows it be flat. So it's possible that it's larger than this, but we just left the average at 20 for the comparison purposes here. And the other major component is semiconductor manufacturing. This is the Global Foundries facility. Again, the question of exactly what the emissions there are in 2024 depends on the activities and level of activity at that facility in 2024. The model, projects basically a pretty stable to slightly declining emissions from that facility, whereas the actual inventory, bounces around, but it's consistently higher by 30,000 metric tons or so. So overall, the model appears to understate expected emissions in the industrial sector by about 50,000 metric tons. It could be higher depending on whether this trend line in the ODS substitutes continues. But again, for the purposes of high level, yes, there's a need to do some calibrating here. Leave that at about 50,000 metric tons of difference. Waste management. This is wastewater and solid waste composting. Here we see that the model consistently understates the solid waste related emissions by about 20,000, 25,000 metric tons per year. The model doesn't include composting at all, whereas the inventory attributes a substantial number of emissions to composting. And then the model and the inventory are both very stable, but stably different. For wastewater emissions, about 5,000 metric tons the other way. On average or so, this works out to, again, about 30,000 metric tons of understatement from the model relative to the inventory. This, again, looks very stable. There's no particular change between 2020 and 2024, so we're pretty confident that the 2024 inventory versus model would show a similar difference. The final sector, a big one, is the agricultural sector. And here we have the enteric fermentation, that's cows, manure management, again, mostly cows, ag soils, and then liming and urea fertilization. On average, over time, the model seems to understate the emissions by about 200,000 metric tons per year. This is after there was some discussion back and forth about the model being too low by a factor of 2 for some other set of adjustments that were made in the model. That's corrected here, and so this is not that. This is just the model versus the inventory just being off by a steady amount, particularly on manure management. Almost a factor of 2 difference between the inventory and the model. There is a methodological error in the inventory itself in the 2020, which is why this 287 drops. The ag soils numbers drop suddenly in 2020. That's the inventory gets closer to the model because the inventory had a small error in it, not because the model has gotten any better. But regardless, overall, we do have about 200,000 metric tons of difference, primarily manure management and ag soils, between the model and the inventory. So if we can, return back to that introductory slide, I've just walked you through each of these numbers, where they come from. In total, add them all up, you end up with this kind of range as I described before. There's no evidence in the model that the trends and what's stable up until 2020 is any different in 2024, and so pretty confident that those differences carry over, as I've described. So pretty confident that if the secretary had used a calibrated model when she did her review this summer, she would have reached a different conclusion regarding where the state stood relative to the statutory limit for the year. So that's a summary of my results. When they post the slides, my contact info will be here if anybody has any follow-up questions, but I think maybe I'll leave this up while there's questions, because this gives us sort of a reference point if there are any, but we can work from there.
Thank you, Dr. Hopkins. And I would invite at this point any subcommittee members from either science and data or cross-sector mitigation who have questions to share those. And best if you can just use the raise hand function. All right. Oh, Ken Jones, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Asa. I really appreciate that work. And I know this has been a topic that was raised when Secretary Moore made those comments. But there's also another piece, and I don't know, and I know you didn't specifically address this, but I don't know if you have an opinion or any non-reported results. And that is the model also projects reductions in emissions based upon programs that are implemented. And the way that the model was rolled out was it included years for which we now have historic information. And I provided, and I believe others did, comments as that model was being developed that they were overstating those reductions. So again, I don't know if you had a chance to look at that, but I at least want to raise that also as an additional factor, which again, there were comments raised, and in many cases they were not addressed, that would also have led to a conclusion that the emissions for 2024 were going to meet the standard.
Yeah, I did not look at trying to sort of check whether the modeling of given policies between 2020 and 2024 was you know, as accurate as it could be. Generally, the places where there's the biggest potential policies that are being modeled, I think, were in the thermal and in the transportation sectors, which you know, the kind of deltas that are here are sort of, you know, so stable and so stably different, and also you know, the policies aren't really focused necessarily on wood energy, for example, right? And so basically restricting these analysis to sort of saying like, well, what can we say that looks like it's something that would carry over kind of no matter what the issues were with what you were just talking about, Ken, rather than trying to also include some factor of whether, you know, a vehicle standard or some other policy was going to have as large an effect as it might be projected to have.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks, Asa. Christine, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Asa. I've been hearing about this issue tangentially off and on for not quite a year. So I want to really thank you for explaining this so clearly today. A huge step forward for the conversation in Vermont. I guess I have two questions. One is, I know that this understanding is new to me today as a result of this presentation. Is this information new to those who've been deep inside the climate conversations in Vermont today as well, or has it been known for a while? And number two, do we know yet anything about what ANR and or the Public Service Department, if that's relevant, intend to do informed by this information, or do we not know that yet?
I don't want to make Asa,
I don't
Dr.
think I'm the right
Hopkins
person to answer either of
answer
those questions. So.
Jared, I don't know if you want to take the first question about how long this issue has been known. I'm happy to as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to share that, you know, I was invited to testify at the beginning of January of 2024 to the Senate Natural Resources and Energy Committee. And as part of that testimony, they asked me to comment on the model, the pathways model versus the inventory. And I found the same discrepancies that we recently updated once there was a new greenhouse gas emissions inventory that went through 2021, and there was a slight update to the pathways model that was done by ANR. In July, we did a side-by-side comparison. I'm happy to put that in the chat. I saw that Matt Cota had asked for this. A side-by-side comparison, updating what we had found in January going through 2020 to what was then the side-by-side comparison of the pathways model versus the inventory going through 2021. So I think that the significant and consistent discrepancy and overall undercounting of emissions in the pathways model versus what's reported in the official inventory as legally required by the Global Warming Solutions Act has been known for nearly a year. I think what is different and what Dr. Hopkins is presenting here is not just what that historical discrepancy has been, but taking the step to then say, well, then what would the projection for 2024 be? And so I'm happy to let others answer that question, but that leads directly to a question I have for you, Asa, which is, in terms of making that 2024 projection, is it just based on recalibrating the historic emissions numbers to what they should be to align with the inventory and then letting the model play out as it was designed? Or were there any other changes to get to the approximate correction for the 2024 emissions estimate? That's a question I will have for you, but in a second. But if anyone else wants to address, it sounded like you may want to, Elena, the second part of Christine's question.
Yeah, I think the only layer that I would add on is Conservation Law Foundation was observing that Senate committee hearing when Jared was raising those concerns, and that alerted us to the issue. And at that point is when we started looking into hiring an expert to really look under the hood and try and get more granular sectoral differences as you're seeing today. And that information is what informed CLF's decision to file a notice of intent to sue against ANR as a mechanism formally to present that concern and seek an opportunity to sit down with the weight of the legal authority behind us and present this information and try and work together to resolve the data challenges we saw that with using the model they were using. And unfortunately, that opportunity hasn't been allowed to us. So we've been urged by the Attorney General to do it through the Climate Council process and the Science and Data Subcommittee, which is why we're here. But the number of the sort of rough total of 230 or 310,000 metric tons over is something that we included in all of our briefing and messaging around the issue for the past few months.
Thank you, Christine and Elena. Asa, I am curious about the question. I mean, it seems like a very straightforward exercise to compare the historic emissions as reported in the official inventory versus the values that were in the model for those sectors and subsectors. I am curious about the future year projections, how those were arrived at.
Sure. So I guess maybe take a step back and describe briefly how the, broadly speaking, that, how to sort of imagine how the LEAP model works. The LEAP is the software that the Pathways 3.27 model is built in. So LEAP is a, first order, it is an accounting framework. It makes sure that everything that goes in comes out, that all the energy demands are met, that all the emissions are accounted for, right? And so it tells you back what you tell it in, right? And it has, so the two ways that the numbers could be out of alignment between inventory and the model are either that different inputs went in, there's a different number of cows in the two cases or whatever, different number of acres of something, different number of gallons of some fuel, that sort of thing, or that the sort of emissions factor associated with those units is different, right? That if in the inventory on average, one cow is worth X amount of manure or whatever, in the LEAP modeling, if there's just a different factor there that results in a different amount of CO2e per cow, right, then you have the same number of cows and you still end up with a different outcome, right? So there's two different places where you could need to do this calibration. And we can't tell which we're working with. And it probably varies across the different sectors. So if you get the factors, particularly if you get the factors corrected, then you really should be able to carry that forward across from 2020 to 2024. If the rough factor per unit needs to be adjusted up by 10%, then if that worked across all the past years and you're carrying forward some number of projection of the total number of gallons of fuel or the total number of cows or whatever it is, to 2024, then that correction should carry through. We can't say for sure that if the issue is putting the right number of gallons or the right number of cows or the right number of pounds of some industrial chemical right in at the beginning, if those inputs are not being entered correctly, or or always the same numbers aren't being entered in both analyses, right? You can't say for sure that that correcting that in the past would correct it for the future, but it certainly should, right? So it ought to be up to the level of accuracy of what Ken was describing, of the model actually trying to capture policies that are driving change and the rate of change at which that is happening. That the rate at which the vehicle fleet is turning over towards electric vehicles, for example, right? The model assumes some overall turnover rate. I haven't tried to say, well, oh, that turnover rate is too high or too low, right? Just to say, generally speaking, on-road and off-road fuels seem to be actually reasonably well calibrated through the past. And so provided that the fleet turns over in the way that you expect the 2024 calculation of that to be not that far off either, right? So it's, but where there isn't some known driver, which is most of the sectors of emissions, 2024 really does look an awful lot like 2020 or 2019, and so you expect those averages to carry over, and that if you corrected either aligned your inputs or got the correct factors to multiply by those inputs, that those would be able to carry forward to 2024, and your 2024 model would then reflect changes that are approximately what we've calculated here.
Thanks, Asa. Are there any other subcommittee questions? Yes, Rich, please.
Again, thank you very much for the presentation. I think I know the answer to this question, but I want to pose it just so you can state it correctly. It seems to me that when people think about recalibrating a model, there are at least two approaches. One approach would be to say, well, the LEAP model consistently is off by X%. And so what we ought to do going forward is to just adjust our sights, as it were, by X%, and then project forward based on that adjustment, a single factor adjustment. And you seem to be suggesting that the way to recalibrate the model would be to go sector by sector, subsector by subsector, and look at each of the input variables, including the emission factors associated with them, and try to true up each subsector based on the best data you've got, and then put all of those changes into the model in order to be able to use the model more confidently to predict where we are and where we're going for the next decade or so. So have I stated that correctly?
Yes. Being able to a sort of I would think of being a sort of percent adjustment kind of thing, being a sort of a one-time near-term kind of thing you could do. But if you're trying to project what a more fundamental set of changes might look like to 2030 to 2040 to 2050, which is one of the real values of having a model like this, you can't just say, oh, well, we're just going to take the cows and multiply them by 1.85 or whatever, right? Like you gotta know a little bit more about what's going on so that you can know, like, oh, if I intervene with policies that do this versus that, right, it's going to change the number of things, it's going to change the factor, it's going to provide an offsetting thing, like whatever it's going to do. Like you need to have those factors really set up rather than just saying, well, okay, like I'm going to take this number and multiply it by 1.1 and this number and multiply by 0.9.
Jane, please go ahead.
Thanks, Jared. And thanks, Asa, for the presentation. I guess I just wanted to respond to Gina's comment in the chat and other comments about ANR's intent. So I just want to acknowledge that we're on the call listening today. We just received Asa Hopkins' report only yesterday. And so we're reviewing the report still. And just with respect to SEI and Stockholm Environment Institute, they've only recently come back under contract with us about a month ago. And as per usual, with an update to the Climate Action Plan due July 1st, we're currently updating the business as usual model. And in accordance, we'll consider new information and other things with respect to that. So just wanted to acknowledge that we're here listening in listening mode today, but thank you for this.
Thanks, Jane. Bram.
I and I suspect others on this call just got an email from TJ Poor apologizing for not being able to join us, and also asking if the model and the supporting information can be made publicly available.
I mean that to be clear, like we didn't build a model. We looked at the state's model, right? So the question of whether the state's model is publicly available is a question for the state. But so the report that was just posted, as Jane mentioned, walks through all of this in more detail, provides each of the sets of numbers for comparison. All the numbers that are presented there are just numbers that come out of either the state's inventory or the state's model. So state folks should be able to easily look through those things.
And the state's model is the LEAP model?
I'm just saying that the pathways 3.27 model, right? That's ANR's model. So they can give access to it to whoever they like.
I'm actually not clear from TJ's email whether he's asking access to that model or to the LEAP model. Does anyone who also got that email have further insight on that?
Jane, go ahead.
I'm sure Jared you could respond to this as well, but the report was just made available to us yesterday, as I stated, and so it was unclear as this presentation was scheduled whether ASA, through his work with CLF, had done and produced a new model to an independent separate model through LEAP or another platform, or whether in fact what we're looking at, he critiqued the current model, and that data and information is in the report that we were provided. So I think based on that, what we are learning today through this presentation, the report that we received likely is enough to satisfy what TJ is asking for. And TJ, being a full partner with the LEAP model, has full access to our LEAP model, and we share licenses with PSD. So thanks.
Excellent. Thank you. We just want to make sure TJ is happy.
Before we move to public comment momentarily, are there any other subcommittee questions or comments?
I think just briefly, I want to clarify that while the report was made available to the state yesterday, this is not new information. The fact that we critiqued the model, we submitted public records requests for all of the data to be able to do this critique, and we have not been hiding the ball. I just want that to be very clear that we've been transparent about our critique and willing to sit down and talk about it. So I'm glad we're, starting today with a little bit more progress.
Thanks, Elena. Breck.
Asa, if this is an unfair or inappropriate question, you can not answer it. I know it's not your job to, say what policies Vermont should be following, but I am curious. It seems to me that let's say that the model discrepancies are correct, and that any corrections to the model have been made. Just taking the numbers that you put here, we'd have to reduce things by about 4% to get to the target level. Do you have some thoughts about the levers that would be that would get us there fastest?
I haven't done particular analysis of that. I mean, there's a classic sort of, you go where you rob banks because that's where the money is, right? Like where there are the biggest emissions is potentially places where you're going to get the biggest bang for reduction. So the thermal and transportation sectors are the obvious places to look for that. I don't know whether there are particular high impact actions in the industrial process chemicals space, for example, right? That are entirely speculative here, right? A large chunk of emissions related to one facility, right? Are there things you could particularly do with respect to that one facility that could have a large near-term impact? I don't know, right? Because some things are lots of emissions from lots of people spread out all over the place, and some things are more controlled. And one of the reasons why the electric number is as low as it is because there's good policy controls and policy impact in the electric sector. And so the electric sector emissions can be really low in Vermont compared to other sectors and compared to other states. Whether there are particular levers to pull with respect to agricultural land management practices or what, I leave that to the other folks. But
Yeah, understood. Thank you.
Thanks, Breck. Thanks, Asa. Okay, now we're going to move to public comment. I see Annette Smith's hand up. If anyone else from the public wants to raise their hand as well, you can be in line after Annette. Annette, please go ahead.
Thank you. I offer my comments as someone who has been monitoring the Climate Council, the Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee, the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee, the Clean Heat Standards Technical Advisory Group. There are all these different subcontractors. There's Opinion Dynamics, NV5, and Energy Futures Group. Now we have Synapse. There's ECS, all of whom are doing models, all of whom are doing models on emissions accounting of some sort. And my overall assessment of what has gone on is that everything that I see has undermined my confidence in any model. I see that it all matters what input you put in and what you get out, and everybody looks at it differently. And then there's the, biogenic emissions problem, and why aren't we counting those? And it's very concerning to see the amount of time and energy and money and lawsuits being spent on something that is obviously not an exact science. And I would like to see us spend our time on things that are actually meaningful. And the more that I see of this modeling, for instance, Synapse's work on Shaftesbury Solar, they had one expert that came in using one model, and then that expert left and another expert came in, and the emissions or the CO2 that was going to be reduced was dramatically reduced by the same company, Synapse's expert, by something like 300,000 tons or something. Forget the exact numbers, but even one consultant had two different experts using two different models, came up with dramatically different numbers. I don't know how anybody makes any sense of this, but I will just say I am very confused.
Annette, is there anyone else who's not a member of the subcommittee who would like to comment at this time? Okay. Well, thank you everybody for taking the time to be here. For folks who are interested in digging in, Sam, please go ahead.
Hi all, thanks Jared. Sam Lashley-Hers, Center for Vermont Regional Planning Commission. I just appreciate the deep dive and the complexity, and I want to just make a sort of small point as we think about future directions. I think obviously there's work to be done here, but also thinking about pathway strategies and actions that might come from some of this work. I just wanted to point to some of the assumptions that we make in the pathways analysis, and thinking really from the perspective of our communities that are getting targets that result from LEAP and from pathways, and then are broken out to the regional level and then come to the town level. And just want to reiterate some of the pleas that we've heard around some ground up data collection efforts, especially in the thermal residential sector around primary and fuel use types. And these are really nitty gritty points. Also around the rate of efficiency measure pickup, from different programs, et cetera, that, it would be really awesome to have some small efforts, even if it's an A&R, wood for residential heating purpose survey. Again, I don't think we've had one since 2016, which was really a small update from 2011. There's just some other ground up work that maybe we could do alongside some of this that would help increase communities' confidence what's in the inputs, and then also give them some real numbers to hold on to, and track their own progress or patterns, and understand best how to move between the state, then the regional, and then the local level, sort of writ all over the pathway strategies and actions and the broader plan. And I know that this is not what we're here to talk about today, but I do think it does speak a little bit to Annette's point, and just thought it'd be worth a mention.
Thanks, Sam. So again, thanks everyone for joining. And just a reminder that if folks would like to review the report that Dr. Hopkins authored and CLF provided, that is on the meeting page on the Climate Council website below this agenda. And I believe correct me if I'm wrong, Asa and Elena, but I believe the slides from today's presentation will also be provided, and those can be posted later by the Climate Action Office. They're not up yet, but hopefully will be able to be shortly. So thank you, everybody, and hope you have a nice day and rest of your week.
Thanks so much, everyone.